Mustafa Warsi, welcome to the In Good Faith podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Iqbal.
Now, I'm super excited about this session. You are a highly impressive man. So
I appreciate that very much, as are you, of course.
No, not at all. So, look, tell me, what's the big proposition? What's on your mind nowadays? What do you want to say to the world?
So I've been thinking more and more about the fact that, unfortunately, for what it's worth, almost nothing of what we consider now to be Islam and what consists of the modern Muslim identity bears any principled resemblance to what I believe the prophetic message genuinely consists of. And that a way to get one's head around this idea is to consider the idea that, Islamically speaking, even there existed prophets and messengers that existed before the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that they existed in varying times and places. So they're not just the Abrahamic religions. They would include some of the Dharmic traditions, for example, or even traditions that you would find in Mesoamerica. And that in a certain sense, the extent of the difference between the prophetic message and whatever we live now should be conceived of as comparable to the distinction between one of those traditions and Islam as we conceive of it at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All this essentially to bring about the fundamental idea that a tradition begins to die and ossify once we start to confuse its form for its essence, once we start to confuse its trappings, that which looks like principle, for principle itself. And so that's something I've been thinking about more and more these days. The idea that essentially, this sort of evokes the idea of like Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces. You know,
Okay.
the idea
In
that
what way?
in the sense that manifestations change all the time, but that which is eternal, that which is stable, that which is principle, that which is fundamentally divine, remains fundamentally static, and that is to be focused on to the exclusion of pretty much everything else, and that to lose sight of that is to bring about the meaning crisis and the broader state of nihilism that we currently exist in within modernity, and don't even know that we exist in. We often confuse this from material trappings, the idea that we haven't modernized quickly enough. Now, obviously, this is certainly true, but the question is, why has that been the case? Why is it the case that Muslim societies, by and large, or societies that identify as Muslim, I want to say, have not been able to do this? And why have they not had the confidence to be able to evolve while still feeling like they've maintained some kind of genuine, immutable, fixed connection with the divine? It is because they've confused that which is eternal for that which is transient, and that which is transient for that which is eternal. And by fixing that which is transient, they've sacrificed that which is eternal, and we are starting to see the fruits of that now.
Oh, the not so tasty fruits.
No.
Is
Fruits
this
that everybody's gagging on.
is this something that you think is exclusive to Islam and Muslims?
No.
Okay, so is it fair to say then the critique broadly that you have here about not being able to see the wood from the trees is something that is affecting all of these major kind of traditions, spiritual traditions, wisdom traditions, religious traditions?
Yes, absolutely. I think to a certain extent, I think it's also true of political traditions. I think it's just the sort of like curse of this stage in history. I think that, for example, you can consider America, you can consider the United States of America, or the American project, which was a deliberate project. It was almost a political, spiritual project. The idea that, there is manifest destiny. We will protect individual rights and freedom of speech, protections from the tyranny of the state. People wrote down a constitution with certain abstract principles in mind, and also cognizant of the idea that those principles are, while the principles are immutable, the forms that they take are not. And should not be, which is why there were provisions allowed for changes in government. But, fast forward 200 years later, and instead there's so much focus. The institutions, the ideas, the institutions, the writings, the forms have been so reified, so exalted, that people have forgotten the true principles under which the country was built. And I think that this will, of course, be the start of its unraveling, just as it has been the unraveling of every major spiritual and ethical tradition the world over. I think this is a natural consequence of, fundamentally, it is a consequence of stopping to ask questions of why, and instead focusing on questions of how. You stop asking about the ultimate point of things. You stop asking about why something is a certain way. What is its cause in the sort of Aristotelian final cause, ultimate cause sense. You know, and instead you start asking questions about, and this includes questions about the meaning of life, about what it means to live a good life, what it means to maintain a good friendship, what is the appropriate political form that we need to organize under, what does it mean to engage in commercially successful business, what does it mean to have a good marriage, or to be a good father. And once we stop asking questions of why and instead start asking questions of how, which is how something is to be achieved, we start engaging in a process of premature optimization, as it were, that results in us often chasing goals that we never really wanted to, or that are very, very far divorced from what principle originally intended. And so I see this as like the general curse of this stage in history.
So essentially the scientific method applied in all of the places where it shouldn't apply.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. And that's correct. And but not just that, it's also being applied. I would say that it's not just the scientific method. It is particularly the sort of positivistic flattening of reality that how do I want to say this? That turns everything into an instrument, a worldview where you and I are nothing more than specks of dust sitting on a wet rock, hurtling through space, in a hostile and meaningless universe. This idea that nothing. It's kind of what Max Weber, the famous sociologist, calls the disenchantment of reality, the flattening of reality, the idea that nothing has any deeper spiritual meaning anymore. And it's kind of interesting because you can see this. I mean, science is particularly rife with this and struggles with this in particular because, like, you see, if you go back and you read Newton, in his Principia, or you read Einstein, or you read any of the great scientists from even relatively recently, you'll find that their writing, even their technical writing. So this, I'm not talking about their private diaries where they're writing under the moonlight. This is like their like technical scientific work is like replete with references to the divine. It is replete with references to the meaning of all this. Replete with references to wonder and awe and spirituality and connection with nature. About not just that these are the facts. These are the facts, and this is what they mean for me. And this is what they mean. This is what they ought to mean for you. There's a certain kind of interpretivity that is going on, a certain respect for the depth of reality, a depth that can only be ascertained at through this process of active interpretation. And it is that we have completely given up on, I think, in this world.
It feels as though there's we talk nowadays obviously of the atomization at the individual level, but there's also the atomization of almost at the kind of subject level, right?
Where it's like the atomization of idea itself almost.
Yeah, exactly. So science becomes divorced from philosophy, becomes divorced from religion, becomes divorced from, everything becomes disintegrated.
Which is also partly why, historically speaking, so many great traditional scholars, and I don't want to say traditional scholars in the sense of purely Islamic religious scholars, I mean, Da Vinci, for example, are today seen as so polymathic. The notion of the polymath is one which feels a little bit alien today, because in a deep sense, nobody is really attempting to grasp reality to try and come to grips with the truth as it is in the world. This is, as you would say, this is missing the wood for the trees.
You in your own right are a little bit of a polymath, I'd say, but or one in the making. So why don't we pause on this for a second, and why don't you tell me a little bit about how did you get into all this in the first place? Why do you even care? And what's the story behind all this?
That's an interesting question. I in a certain deep sense, I feel like it's impossible not to care about this at the sole exclusion of basically everything else, and it feels like it is a sort of very ardent effort for me to sort of wake up and go to work and try and live a normal civilized life and not just spend all my time daydreaming about abstractions. But fundamentally speaking, I to introduce myself, I guess I trained as a mathematician back in the day at the University of Cambridge. My plan was I when I was a teenager, I used to like stargazing. and I spent a lot of time, walking around in the city, looking up at the stars. And I thought, wow, this is so beautiful. I could spend my life doing this. And then I thought to myself, okay, well, why don't I try and do that? And so I decided to consider studying astronomy, and then from there got interested in physics, and then from there I got interested in the principles that underlie physical phenomena. And this is what led me to mathematics. And then I remember. And simultaneously, it wasn't simply a question of mathematics, which in the deep sense is not really a question of calculations. It's the study of structure, the study of deep structure and principles. Now, this is not so distinct from the notion of it's almost theological, and indeed, I was always, I guess, to a certain extent, interested in deeper questions of like what am I doing here? What is the purpose of this? Why must I do this or do that, or why is somebody doing this or that, or concerned with this? And I came across a quote, a proverb, which was written by a Sufi mystic 1,000 years ago, which sort of like really struck me at the time. And it goes something like, the book of God was written on 2 pages, scripture and nature. And if you want to understand God, you must study both. And the study of scripture is theology, and the study of nature is mathematics. And that is why in the early days, even at the, as part of the trivium, immediately after that, the first subjects offered at classical universities were theology and mathematics. And so I thought to myself, okay, well, these are the 2 things I'm genuinely very interested in. And I suppose mathematics won out in the end when I went to study. And then, I sort of went down a path that I think was fairly typical, which was that I came in with this very ardent sense of romance about spending my time trying to study the mysteries of the universe, and then eventually sort of had a headlong collision with academia. Realized that in a certain sense the institutional structure was set up in such a way so as to maximally suck out the heroism and romance from the endeavor itself. It became a paper pushing exercise. People hate Kissinger for a lot of reasons, but one thing he was absolutely right on was his like scathing criticism of academia. The idea that in a certain sense they're so belligerent and so cantankerous precisely because the stakes are so small, and you really felt that at the time. And so I left the academic path, and then eventually ventured into industry and professional life, much like everybody else did, mostly for practical purposes. You got to pay the bills, and you have to try and learn a bit.
Your Darwinian instinct.
Yeah, well, I do have to live, right? And so you must first live and then ask questions. And so I ended up in industry, and then at a certain point, maybe a couple of years into it, or maybe quite a few years into it, I basically ended up having conversations with a couple of old friends I remember. And I thought at the time that I had like a lot of like fairly ready answers about what it is I deeply believed, and I felt like my worldview was cogent and broadly made sense. And then I discovered shockingly that was not true. I thought I was like a fairly orthodox Muslim, except I was like a really I like to say I was like a rational Muslim, or in a certain way unorthodox, and that I wanted to modernize in this fairly superficial, transparent way. But then, I had a couple of conversations with people, and then, I started thinking, somebody asked me to explain the nature of God to them. And that's it. I mean, they literally asked me the question, explain to me the nature of God. And I started trying to do that. And I remember thinking, this was a couple of years ago, I remember thinking halfway through that conversation that even I didn't believe what I was saying. This was ridiculous. I had no idea what I was talking about.
Can you give an indication of the kinds of things that you were saying that you didn't believe as you were saying them?
I was talking about God as being beyond space and time. I was talking about having a unified power. I was talking about, a necessary being that is still ultimately personal and really, really cares about how each of us live and don't live, and that didn't feel compelling at all. I sort of rehashed parts of the Kalam cosmological argument, which again, I don't know how much I believe or care about. And I kept trying to go down this sort of this rational discourse about the necessity for a creator, the need for some kind of intelligent design or blah blah blah. And then I just realized ultimately I didn't believe in myself. It didn't.
So I understand on this rational kind of arguments, can sort of almost analytic, philosophical arguments. But what about the thing around you mentioned interestingly the thing to do with almost the personal nature of God, or the God that cares about this or that or the other.
Yeah.
So what's the issue there? Because obviously that's a very, scripturally speaking, that comes across thick.
Very strongly. Yeah, of course. Yeah, it is like the.
So what were you struggling with there?
I was struggling at the time. I was struggling a lot with connecting, this necessary being, which you would identify with, existence itself, and why this sort of this necessary being that is so far removed from what we might think of as a person would care about us, and to what extent does the notion of caring even make sense for that being? And to that end, I realized that I still think that that's true, by the way. Now I do think that that's true, but I think at the time, you realize that quite a lot of work needs to be done before you can get to a place where you think, okay, actually it does make sense that, existence is deeply involved, that we are intertwined with existence, that our morality does in fact open existence, that it dialogues with existence, that in a certain sense, God and existence itself, being itself, wujud itself, is personal because everything is personal. And that to think that things are not personal is to forget the sort of deeply intersubjective nature of life itself. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, so maybe we need to unpack it a little bit, but that's almost where you've got to. So anyway, let's go back to, you were speaking to your friends. You were basically giving them a narrative that you weren't overly comfortable with yourself. You weren't buying your own Kool-Aid, basically.
No.
Then, what happened then? That instigated a deeper search.
Essentially, I want to say a crisis of. A crisis of faith is a bit strong to say, because it's not like I genuinely felt like I was going to leave, but more I just felt like I'd missed something huge, and that in a certain sense I felt like I'd been living my whole life in a castle of sand, and that it started raining, and and so the
dark night of the soul.
Indeed, indeed, actually, and so I went. And despaired for a bit, and spent a bit of time looking around, trying to think about what to do. And then I guess a good friend of mine, a mutual friend of ours, he just mentioned offhand a book to me to study and to read. And I don't think he mentioned it in the context of whatever I was going through. He just sort of said, oh, well, maybe you'll find this kind of interesting, because I find it interesting. And so I did, and I remember reawakening, thinking, "Oh yes, actually, everything does make sense. This is God's truth."
Okay, and the book being
this was Isutsu's Sufism and Taoism. And it was so interesting to me because I at the time, while I was struggling with the idea, I spent a bunch of time pouring into or reading parts of the Quran again and again, and trying to spend a bit of time interpreting it, recognizing that I didn't have sufficient context to interpret. And I don't mean context in the historical sense, okay, this verse was revealed at the Battle of Badr and was in a reference to this event that happened at the Battle of Badr. I mean context in the deeper sense of having a sufficient connection with the divine, feeling sufficiently spiritual that which, not the words itself, but that which underlies the words, connects with you. And so I was struggling to do that. I felt like this was impossible. I was reading it, and you say, okay, well, it is incredibly lyrical. It's very beautiful. It's true. But I don't, you don't feel it. And so
but interestingly, was it that you weren't feeling it here, or was it that it wasn't clicking here? Meaning, was it that it wasn't meeting the kind of rational component?
It was
because if you're talking about beauty and the literary component, that feels more of the heartfelt sort of thing, right?
That's true.
So which part was it then?
Oh, it's kind of interesting because in the very, very deep sense, I don't really distinguish. I think that it's very. I don't really distinguish. I think that it's possible to have, the way if I present to you a very cogent argument. It's very easy to hold an argument in your head and to study it from various angles. But knowing something to be true in your mind is very different from knowing something to be true in your soul, and that's what I meant by really feeling it.
Yeah, sure, okay.
And so you get the sense that something is beautiful, but you don't really connect with it, and that's really what that means.
So how did Sufism and Taoism, this book, how did it help?
It was so interesting to me because I recognized, ultimately speaking, that I was coming at Islam from a relatively narrow vantage point, one that was, and this ties back very neatly to the beginning of this discussion, right? A very narrow vantage point, which is from within the sort of confines of a Muslim identity that I'd erected for myself and that I'd largely inherited, from my circumstances and my parents and the people around me, and that I was that it was through this worldview that I was reading this book. But what was so interesting about Sufism and Taoism was that it presented me with a view of Islam, a view of Sufism, a notion of the divine that was so fundamentally alien from that which I'd encountered before, but that also was presentable in a precisely analogous way in the guise of a totally different tradition, namely in one of the dharmic traditions, in Taoism. And so studying the Tao made it clearer to me what the Quran was about. Funnily enough,
So say more about that. How?
Because what it did was it helped. To a certain extent, it comes back to, again, like things we've been discussing. It helped me see the wood for the trees. It helped me realize that actually it's not the Arabic that matters. It's not the words that matter. It's not the concatenation. It's not the events. It's not the legislation. I mean, all of these things are very good and very important and very fundamental, but ultimately downstream of the principle. And the principle is that of, how do I want to put this? The principle is that of a fundamental union or connection with the deeper nature of existence itself. It is about fundamentally intuiting, not speaking, not communicating, not analyzing, not rationalizing, but fundamentally intuiting, and then ultimately dissolving in the mystery and beauty of existence itself. And that feeling, the calling that you have to do this, is the divine beckoning you. It is, and you feel it all the time. You feel it. You feel echoes of it when you fall in love, or when you look at something incredibly beautiful. When you feel a state of awe, or when you feel a state of peace, or when you feel a state of quietude, even when you feel a state of ecstasy and excitement. Which is not to say that it is ultimately emotivistic. It is simply to say that these are all things that point to. They're not the thing itself, because the thing itself, the divine itself, is beyond all speech.
Finger and moon.
Precisely, yeah. The finger is not the moon. The finger simply points at the moon, And while we can stare at the moon, it's hard to ever be on the moon. It's hard to ever present the moon.
What's just on a side, what's really interesting about the finger and moon thing, which is was popularized by one of the Bruce Lee movies where he comes up. But it's so interesting that the analogies used in the narrations attributed to Prophet peace be upon him about the vision of God is likened to seeing the full moon.
Which
is obviously for human beings one of the most powerful experiences, really, or life experiences, I think, just looking at the full moon. But yeah,
of course. Which brings us once again to the idea, the sort of ultimately symbolic nature of reality, and that is something that people miss out. That it is in fact fundamentally interpretive, and that underneath and underlying all these symbols, there must exist some principle that is evocative of the divine, and that we spend our lives in this constant state of interpretation, but that one needs to first, I guess, practice, and secondly to put oneself in the appropriate mindset where one can engage in this state of ready interpretation, where one looks at everything and ultimately sees underneath it the divine. You look at a thing, but you perceive the divine. And this was a mindset or a worldview that ultimately was very cogently and clearly expressed. It's sort of, this not just monotheistic, the idea that there is one God and that this one God is distinct from creation, but in a certain deeper sense, a theomonistic view.
Okay, explain that. What's theomonistic?
Well, the idea that it's not just that there is one God that exists; it is the idea that there is only one thing that exists, and that is God.
Okay, and that
to the extent that everything else exists is the extent to which it is evocative of the divine, and that to the extent that it is not, it is in shadow.
Yeah, just on this, because I do have some of these discussions sometimes with some people privately, and you can appreciate this natural sources of discomfort, right? When we start to go from monotheism to
Theomonism,
theomonism,
of course, yeah. Of course.
in terms of, because then the kind of the knee-jerk response is, oh, what? So what? So you're God then? The tree's God, the table's God. How do you deal with that? It's a kind. What's the difference then? Maybe the way to ask the question is, what's the difference between a theomonistic view and a pantheist view? Let's say.
So the distinction has to do with highlighting the nature of what it means for something to be symbolic. When you look at your reflection in the mirror, your reflection, the image, is not you. It is something that reminds some you of you, but it is not in fact you. It is not identifiable with you. It is not distinct from you either. It is dependent on you. If you were to change, then your image were to change additionally. Your image cannot affect you, but you would affect your image. So consequently, the way to think about pretty much everything, I would say, is that to varying degrees, and this is important, to varying degrees, everything is an image or a metaphor.
Or refraction.
A refraction.
I think the light analogy maybe helps with this as well.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
Refracting the divine light.
Into multifarious colors. Yeah.
Okay, fine. All right. So you read this book, clarified a lot of things, maybe settled things for you. You felt you had a better perspective, and then what happened?
So then, then it was kind of interesting because after I read that, I started reading more and more about, funnily enough, I felt like reading about other traditions made me a better Muslim, and it wasn't just a question of like gaining an appreciation for whatever I thought Islam was because, oh, look at how wayward these other traditions were. It was actually the total opposite. It was actually, you read about, Taoism, and you read about mystical Christianity. You read some of the Zohar and some stuff in the Kabbalistic traditions. You read all of this stuff, and you realize that ultimately speaking, reality is and can only ever have been metaphysically unified. It can only ever have been one thing. There is just one reality that we are all subsisting in. And to that end, and not in a sort of like lovey-dovey, we're all one kind of way, but in a fairly rigorous technical sense, all major traditions were simply different signposts, all of which were pointing at the same object, an object that is fundamentally unspeakable, which is obviously the divine. And that to the best of their ability, every tradition was attempting to purvey this divine truth in a form that was apt to its circumstances, and that the aptitude to circumstance explains a great deal of why the traditions feel so distinct from each other. Now, Muslims, every tradition loves to claim a certain kind of exclusivity. Every tradition loves to claim a certain kind of exclusionarity. Now, to some extent, this has to do with purification of idea, because it is the case that as traditions mature, as they ossify, as they decay, people confuse the wood for the trees, people confuse the finger for the moon, and traditions start to decay, and that in order to distinguish a new tradition, a nascent commitment to principle from decaying traditions, one must first keep pure, as in keep the ideas pure, and this will involve a certain kind of exclusion. But secondly, as opposed to rather than simply the principled reason for it, there's also an instrumental reason for exclusion, which is to ensure a certain kind of in-group cohesion that will allow the new community predicated on this new revelation to solidify and emerge and develop and exist. And so the sort of exclusivity impulse takes both of these into account. But once you are cognizant of this, once you're aware of this, you recognize that this is not principled enough to distinguish the truth in each faith from the truth in any other. For there's no other truth in other faiths. There is simply the truth. And all faiths are trying to point at it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
And so,
go on.
sorry, I was just going to say that, like, and so to a certain extent, that brings me back to the original point, which was the idea that almost everything that we conceive of as constituting the Muslim identity today, to a certain extent, needs to be rethought or repackaged, re-understood. And this is it's not simply a question of repackaging it in order to better deal with modernity. Which is a thing that a lot of people say, that we need to rethink about what it means to be Muslim, how we need to live in order to better compete, on the modern field.
Or compete, or sometimes, some of the early stuff that I read around, Quranic contextualization.
Yeah.
I would always get really put off when it kind of was prefaced with the almost the impetus for doing so was almost so that we can be seen to be relevant.
Yeah, precisely.
And I hated that. Like that's not good enough.
You want to tell me some more about this?
No, meaning like as in, again, it just felt, it's almost like we need to preserve the in-group thing.
Mm-hmm.
We realize from the outside we're seen to be unreasonable.
Yes, unfortunately.
It assumes the kind of correctness or fixity of whatever
the truth and that we possess it.
Yeah. That also, but also whatever the dominant worldview is that you're in the context of which you're having to respond.
Yes.
As well, right? So that too. So there's a kind of defeatism. It's not like so it's almost like a pragmatic contextualization, not a principled contextualization.
Exactly.
Right. It should be coming from within, deeply.
Yes.
So
we're also
with
a concern, with a deep concern for the truth. Like, what is the truth?
Yeah, exactly.
As opposed to what is the argument and how can I best frame it in order
or what's convenient.
And to respond to this objection that this guy has put forward. And so to a certain extent, I realized that like a big part of the issues that Muslims face, or I mean not just Muslims, I mean this is true of people of all faiths really, face in the modern world, stem essentially from a they stem from a forgetfulness of what they've lost. In a certain sense, they've which is this deeper connection with the divine. The idea that in a certain sense, it's not a question of like, what is the difference if I or anybody else were to stare at something on the table, like a candle on the table, and a man who'd achieved enlightenment, a man who'd achieved satori in the Zen tradition, or fana in the Islamic tradition, or an awakening in the Christian tradition. If he were to sit here and look at the same candle, the question is, would they see different things? And the answer is no. They would see precisely the same thing. As in, they would receive the exact same sensory data, but they would perceive different things. Insofar as the second man, the enlightened man, would perceive the divine spark that animates the existence of this candle in a way that the first man does not. And so comparably, this is the most extreme example of the sort of I want to say three-dimensionalizing of reality, something that like modernity has lost. The idea that in a certain sense we don't see that which underlies, that which is below, that which is beneath, and instead this is most clearly seen in the sort of endless obsession inside the community of with fiqh and with law. Everything ultimately becomes reduced to the law because the law is fundamentally mechanistic. It is questions of how. The law is not a philosophical endeavor. The law is a mechanistic endeavor.
Yeah, but it should be a philosophical endeavor.
Precisely, yeah. And everybody, there will be people who will object to this in a principled way and start talking about how, it's not about any law itself. It's about the tradition that produced these laws, and actually the tradition is what's important, and the judicial process is what's important, and the process consists of some combination of taqleed, following tradition and analogical reasoning, and that it is blah blah blah. They'll say all of this stuff, but to a certain extent, this is also done inappropriately. Even the way in which the tradition engages with the judicial process is ossified. It is static. Nobody has even considered to ask whether or not the process itself is best suited as a modern expression of principle, the way it used to be. If you stop and you imagine, a lot of this brings me back to something that upsets me more than anything else, which is the state of the elites within faith communities all around, and this includes Muslims and I think everywhere else. I think this is also true of Christianity. is the idea that it's the idea that like even the people that they hallow and venerate so much, if like the people like Ghazali or people like Ibn Sina, if they were alive today, then they would be acting in ways that are completely contrary to what the scholars of today who are quoting them would be acting
absolutely.
like. It's and this which brings me back to, I think, one of the one of my favorite contentions by Tim Winter, which is the idea that one must not do as the greats did, but instead seek what they sought, and that it is that spirit, and that really once again clarifies, this fundamental idea that we've been like revolving around the whole time, which is not to confuse the finger for the moon, which is not to absolutize symbols, not to forget that which is ultimate and that which is true for that which is convenient, that which is instrumental.
Yeah.
In a deeper sense, this is also what I would consider shirk to be, like the essence of what shirk is.
100%. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It is to confuse. It is not simply the worship of a stone thing, or because like even polytheists are not silly enough to, like most polytheists are not silly enough to believe that something that they have built and that something that they will destroy is something that will physically intervene and physically solve the things in their lives, right? And so the reduction of the gravest, most mortal sin in the faith to something that is so silly is itself something that ought to be questioned. And that when you question it, you recognize that actually the thing that we're revolving around, the fundamental issue that is causing so much of our distance, our nihilism, our meaninglessness, our vice, I would say, even stems from this absolutization of symbols. It is the confusion of form for essence, the confusion of the shape with which something arrives, its manifestation, with its purpose.
So it's in that vein that I know we've discussed it briefly before. We can maybe discuss a little bit more now. Hopefully, viewers and listeners aren't bored of my constant banging this drum. But
please,
it's exactly that what you've said in a better articulated way than probably I would put it. That leads me to still remain very concerned with the retention of the terminology that also becomes absolutized, right?
Yes.
Like I have zero confidence that we can maintain a notion of Islam and Muslim without them remaining sort of absolutized as kind of and kind of misconceived internally and externally. And basically, again, as I've said before in other discussions, like I think exactly the same problem. And I think I asked you that question earlier about whether you think the sort of ills that you identified applied more generally, and I say the same thing right now because it's important to emphasize that this is not some sort of self-loathing type of endeavor where we are so frustrated with our own things and the world is so great. No, it's like these are common human issues that are going on left, right, and center. But the point being is that the thing that's often said, right? There was no Buddhism at the time of Buddha, no Christianity at the time of Christ.
Precisely.
And there was, interestingly, the word Islam was circulating at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, but certainly not in any way similar to how it is being utilized now. And so therefore, given everything that you said, and given now the context, one major feature of the current context that we're functioning in, which was so different to the past, which is the exponential shrinking of the world.
Yeah.
Right? And when linguistic and other cultural kind of barriers historically are becoming, I'm not saying that they're disappearing by any means, but they're certainly at least surmountable for those who want to surmount them, right? So to that end, surely we have to move to a language and terminology that speaks of human endeavor in relation to truth, right? As opposed to this or that group's kind of particular system where essentially then by necessity one feels the identity kind of politics stuff kicks in, the adherence to tradition at the expense of being porous enough to actually just include all sources of available knowledge and different wisdoms and traditions. Like, I think, yes, for somebody who has a certain perspective, like you can distinguish these things and be able to maybe see and read things in such a way that is almost plural by principle, right? Like the idea that,
Yeah, it must
it's
be.
that idea that the great gate of with 10,000 ways,
Yeah, yeah.
But I feel like, but an extreme measure is almost required, yeah, to almost help people actually, really challenge this notion as to whether you need to identify in this way in the first place, and whether there is even a religion called X, Y, Z in the first place.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's also interesting, right? Because there's like, you see like echoes of this idea in various places, and none of which are quite articulated well enough that they permeate the consciousness of the modern man of faith, man or woman of faith. And one of these was like an idea that was fashionable some time ago, which was the idea that, the notion of a religion is really a Western idea. It's born of the separation of public life and private life, and religion is a private thing that you do, and then you go in public and you engage in secular activity. And it's fundamentally dualistic in a way that Islam is not dualistic. It can never be dualistic, and so there's no distinction between private life and public life. You're a Muslim here, you're a Muslim there, you're a Muslim everywhere. And like they love saying stuff like that, right? And so in a certain kind of sense, like it kind of gets
it was getting something.
No. So that's kind of getting at it, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of getting at the sort of like deeper idea that in a certain that past the point, the terms, the concepts, as you say, even the concepts with which we cognize of the truth can ultimately be shackling. They can ultimately become absolutized, as you say, and absolutized in a way that ultimately preclude us from coming to grips with the truth. And sometimes you do, in fact, need a change of perspective and a shift, which is, and again, circling the same idea, the idea that it took me to read about Taoism to start appreciating Islam better.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I have experienced the same thing. I mean, last couple of years, like the more I've read other traditions, and also the challenges within other traditions, the perspectives, definitely, like, just personally, like from a faith perspective, I just feel it's become a lot more, it feels a lot more natural, deeper, confident as well.
Yeah.
Because actually now, like, the whole thing before was almost, there was this inherited defensiveness, right?
Yeah.
And now there's no defensiveness about this group versus that group or the other thing. It's like you said, it's almost now people can, you can come around the table and look at the problem over there rather than sit on other sides of the table and look at the other person as the problem.
Yeah, it's true.
Which is a completely different dynamic.
It's true.
And that goes deeper beyond, again, just a kind of, a sort of an interfaith dialogue, just for the sake of,
because again, interfaith has to do with like social political compromise,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
As opposed to the joint pursuit of truth.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, fine. All right. So one and then another. Okay. Well, actually, let me press you just one last time on this one then.
Yeah.
What are you saying then? Because are you saying that, practically speaking, within these various communities that identify in certain ways and where all of the problems that you've spoken about are very, very, very entrenched, and in the context of, this is all at the end of the day, has led to and is leading to a deeper divisions in society, which then play out in ways that, mess everything up and make truth seeking more difficult. Is it fair to say that actually, like, is it now what seems like the extreme thing is actually almost the reasonable or obvious thing to be doing, which is to really help people, like the average person now, to really kind of disentangle and separate, right, these terms, and maybe even challenge the use of these terms as central ways of identity. Even I would say, once upon a time, I thought it was a good thing that in the census, this question of religion was posed. And I'm not so sure. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, where, this percent is this and this percent is that. And then, every 10 years, the Muslims can celebrate because,
because now they're 5% instead of 4%.
Right, exactly. That's not the point. It's just so misses the point in in every way. So are we? Can we take our iconoclasm down to this level where we?
It's an interesting question, right? Because like it depends in great extent to a great extent whether or not people are ready, and how this could even happen. How what is the mechanism? Again, this is an instrumental question. The mechanism by which terminology could be reintroduced.
I think it's just modeling it. That's what I try to do.
Which is to exemplify, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I use model.
Well, for you it makes sense,
No, you're right. Exemplify, absolutely. Yeah. That is only what I meant, and nothing else. Exactly. But to exemplify it, right? Like, I think to actually, if somebody asked me today, "Are you a Muslim?" I'll say no, but not in the way that you think.
Yeah.
Right? Right? Because for me, yes, I try to be Quranically Muslim,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
I don't identify with your capital M Muslim.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So therefore now in the census thing, I don't know what I'm ticking. Exactly. New category. It's like I'm a nun, but I'm not that nun.
Yeah. Or
like,
any nun you've ever heard
listen,
of. Yeah.
you can't box me, baby. But it's like, but then, so that's the thing. And now, interestingly, so I've been thinking just on a practical benefit approach, right? On practical benefit basis, partly instrumental, but partly I think goes to something deeper. You've talked about like how you benefited from like reading about different traditions and stuff.
Yeah.
I think there's something deeper, which is, again, once upon a time I would have balked at this idea, but now it's like, no, but what about actually participating in practice?
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which is very challenging again to people, but meditation, as an example, is not something that is. It's really interesting because I've mentioned in some discussions before in this podcast that like it's almost like it was almost a condition of revelation even taking place, in prophetically speaking.
Yeah.
Because this idea of silent cave-based meditation is what is understood to has been a precursor over a long periods of time, precursor to this revelatory period. But then it doesn't feel that we receive these notions of being taught that there's something to do there, right? And it kind of finds its form in a prayer and maybe an i'tikaf, right? The seclusion in Ramadan.
Or dhikr a little bit.
And dhikr a little bit, yeah. But like I'm talking about that kind of almost more
serene,
but
isolated,
exactly.
monastic,
right?
Removed connection with.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Now, what's interesting though is that
man alone. With
what about the opposite though, right? So I would say the average Muslim would find it beneficial to incorporate into their practice, right? I don't know, zazen or whatever, right?
Yeah,
I love some silent sitting meditation.
Yeah.
Now, but by contrast, also as a way to export the notion of salah, right? And to show how powerful a practice this practice is, right? Which is embodied, in mindful, dialogical, imaginal, like all of these different things, where like at the moment the lines are so thick in the way that we conceive of ourselves and others, in the sense that there's no a Muslim does this, not a human does this. Or it's not like not a human can do this, or you do this so that you can become human.
Yeah.
It's again just lost in these technical things. So again, another benefit of this kind of seeing these things differently is to say, well, okay, the world is your oyster kind of thing from a knowledge practice perspective. You can incorporate, and again, these are things which people, I think Abraham Heschel, he wrote this piece I read recently, No Religion is an Island.
Yeah.
All right, and basically commenting on the fact that, and which is well recognized, that actually historically, the average Muslim today doesn't seem to realize that what they call Islam today has been influenced by, shaped by so many outside things. But then again, from one perspective, that feels shocking and difficult. From another perspective, it's like the most obvious thing in the world. So that's people doing stuff, and people spoke and interacted. It's like
and people collaboratively searched for the truth together.
Exactly.
And that engaged that involved like borrowing practices and reinterpreting our own practices and finding whatever form best fit the principle, the manifestation of the principle, which is to ultimately seek connection, union with the divine. That's a very good example, by the way, the idea of zazen and connecting with prayer in a certain sense, right? Because another way in which it becomes so manifestly obvious that signs have been absolutized, that we've mistaken the wood for the trees, is the sort of like tacit idea. You see this particularly in like parts of the subcontinent, that like you just like go through the physical motions that constitute prayer, or the idea, again particularly rife in the subcontinent, that people will memorize the Quran but have absolutely they can make the sounds, but they have absolutely no notion of what it means. And obviously, like at a quote unquote rational level, you can say, okay, well, this is kind of strange, and then you can say, oh, actually, but the sounds themselves have some kind of mystical quality, and that the sounds are beneficial. But more fundamentally speaking, it is once again an absolutization of symbol.
I just thought of a good contention for this.
Go on then.
Which is don't let your prayer be physics without metaphysics.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Or one I had before actually was motion without emotion. Yeah.
I like that.
There you go. All right. Yeah, write that down. Okay, cool. All right, so now let's. Where are we? Fine. So we've parked
So we've
that.
talked about absolutizing
Yeah.
symbols.
So we'll leave that there. What about now? So one other question which I've been like really pondering a lot over the last couple of years, which I feel more comfortable in now, a lot more comfortable. Um, okay, let me ask it this way. I'm interested in understanding how your explorations, where your explorations left you in your understanding of what the Quran was, right? In the sense of when you say it's revelation, like in what way? Like were you or are you interested in questions around like ontologically, sort of what is it? The mechanism of revelation. You spoke earlier about the difficulty of like personal God, but then it became difficult, but then it became like more natural again. The standard narrative around revelation is, God speaks through an angel essentially, and narrates, to a prophet who's almost conscious, not not in a complete sense, but almost like his own sort of conscious agency is like completely and utterly suspended.
Yes.
And then he essentially just like parrots that out like as received, but where there's as if it's as much as a shock to him almost as it might be to anybody who would hear.
Who's hearing?
And bound up with that idea, I don't know, it feels as though linked to. I'm interested in the question of almost like the ontology of the mechanism to the extent that it allows for an understanding that justifies kind of rereadings, contextualization, multiple layers of right.
Sure.
I'm not. It's not because it's, and so then subsequently I thought to myself, well, maybe these questions don't matter really. The thing exists, right? And we can make reasonable conclusions about how to interpret and how to work with text, regardless of like almost the. How much of it is divine source, how much of it is prophetic filtering or conditional filtering, whatever.
This is like a Gadamard kind of like changing the horizon of interpretation.
Right, yeah, kind of. So maybe it doesn't matter, but I've also, there's part of me that feels no, it does matter to maybe to theorize around this, because what feels bound up with a much more fixed way of seeing everything is that, well, God said it, so like,
it must be true.
So shut up, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so whereas it feels like you have to do some work to justify contextualization.
Yes, or interpretation of it.
Yeah, and interpretation, and where you might even depart from text.
Yes.
Exactly as you said, depart from the surface to kind of recover the essence, essentially. But then that feels like you have to say something a bit deeper about what the revelatory moment even was in the first place, such that it allows you to do that.
Yeah. That's I think that's true, by the way, as in all of that is true. Here's a question for you. I'm actually quite curious because it'll inform the rest of this. It'll inform the rest of this discussion, which is: do you think that revelation is gradated, or do you think that it's qualitatively a different experience than something that anybody can have?
I think it's gradated. Yeah.
Right. So how would you?
Yeah. The way I found when I've written sort of to myself and just privately to people about this. But maybe this is a coming out moment on this one, which is to say that
I'm here for it.
No. Well, look, and what's interesting? I really think so much of what we have discussed is actually scripturally so defensible as well. By the way, and I'll give some examples of that now, actually, with this, because essentially, So the question was the Quran a manifestation of a human's experience of the divine, let's say, and receiving divine communication. Yeah, exactly. So your question is, was it different categorically or different just in terms of extremity and consistency almost?
And quantity, yeah. Is it a difference in quantity, or is it different in is it a difference in quality?
Yeah. So I would say, it's like there's a continuum, right? And essentially, like this was just on one end of that spectrum.
Yes.
And that's what makes it so remarkable, is that the other interesting thing is that somehow I've also felt that this conceptualization affords so much more respect to the prophet, actually.
Of course,
meaning that he's so tapped in, right? And
absolutely, as the kids would say, locked in.
Yeah, exactly, so locked in, like low key locked in, yeah. Right, that he was just like, some viewers will get that, or their children will get it. that basically, like, that he was almost, because it's like, I think there's something around where in the standard narrative, what's missing is that, like, he was a man who earned this.
Yeah.
As much as was given it.
Yes.
Through an act of divine grace. And again, it's like, obviously, like chicken, egg, and yin yang. Like, how do you differentiate all of this, right? But the lines become very thin at some point. But I think it does speak to that. Now, Quranically speaking, of course, though, if you just very cursorily, if you look at the concept of wahi, right, the wahi is used for, the three way I just look at it quickly is right, the inspiration to the bee,
Yes.
right, which is so then it's almost like how does the bee know what to do through wahi, right, through revelation, or now we'll say inspiration, right? But essentially the word wahi is used. I mean, you have to also, for the literalists,
That is the word that is used.
So I mean, there's often no coherence sometimes to the way some arguments. Oh yeah, no, but that's ilham. No, hang on a second, mate. Right? Wahi, that's the word. And then the idea, the mother of Moses now wants to put the basket. Has the idea to put the basket
That's so
into the.
yeah.
That's wahi. Awhayna ila ummi Musa. Right? We revealed to her. Yeah, not alhamna ilayha, or we didn't inspire. Like he doesn't. It says awhayna, and then elsewhere, right, where at the end of this is at the end of Surah Shura, I think, chapter 42. Like it's not befitting for a person except that God should communicate through wahi, or right, illa wahyan, or min wara'i hijab, or from behind a veil, or yursila rasulan, right, or that he would send a messenger. And then there's a difference of interpretation. Is that an angelic
messenger
being or a human being? And then that person would convey essentially by God's permission whatever he wishes. Fine. But the point being is the first one
is revelation. Yeah.
Well, exactly. So but here you have a revelation which if you have a third category of revelation, which is through a messenger, but over here you have a revelation which just feels very general.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden, now your ability to this is why I've kind of. Again, and this sounds very controversial, I know, but it's I almost kind of think like the doctrine of prophetic finality, whilst it might be true in one sense, it's almost not helpful to hang on to, actually, in some ways.
Yeah,
right? You can tell me if I'm wrong or what you think, right? Because, again, it kind of just smacks of this idea that, like, it's all done and dusted, essentially, and it encourages this closed-mindedness.
So I do agree.
So it's like we can't interact with God in our present moment to create.
Yes,
so it locks us, basically. So fine, post-prophetic, whatever, and we're not saying, okay, well, let's all claim to be prophets or sages or whatever, right? That's for whoever to say or not say, right, in terms of... But that's not the point. The point is like, no, at least let's say collectively, we still have a very prophetic function to fulfill.
Absolutely, right? We are in fact God's vice regents on this earth.
Exactly,
right?
but but in a way that we can derive that inspiration through our interaction, dialogue, yes, learning from history and everything else, but through our direct connection with the divine, and not underestimating the extent to which that can take place somewhere on that continuum. Might be far behind, obviously, where it was, but the continuum still exists.
Of course,
and everybody is somewhere on it.
Man is the trustee. Man is a trustee of reality, right? That in a certain sense, we are to be intermediators between the divine and the rest of reality. And that this privileged function, the ability of a man to engage in a kind of wahi that is greater than that of a bee, for example, and in the extremal sense.
That although the bees are probably ahead right now, to be honest.
I mean, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad out there, It's not great.
Okay, fine. So then where are maybe summarize this in terms of,
no, I think
what is revelation? Contextualize it. How do you see it?
No, I think that's why I asked you the original question, right? That's why I asked you the question of like kind and quantity, because largely speaking, I agree, which is the idea that ultimately speaking, every time one engages in a kind of perception of anything, a fact or looking around the room, or a conversation, or listening to something, or even dreaming, or a thought. Every time one engages in a kind of perception, one ultimately has to interpret this perception in order to give it meaning, in order to engage in a kind of meaning making or a meaning discovery. I don't want to say making so far, but yeah.
I think generating is nice.
Yeah. Like generating or discovering a kind of meaning from things that have happened. And this process can, in a certain sense, take place kind of in sort of like two dimensions. It can either take place kind of horizontally, I want to say, which is to say, again, to ask the question of how things happen, right? Or how things are arranged, or how things are put together. And secondly, to consider questions of, and the second dimension I would say is vertically, which is to consider questions of why, which is what is the cause of this? What is the purpose of this? What is it for? What is its ends? You know, and so I would distinguish between these two ways. And in a certain sense, Wahi, there is part of the problem with modernity, with how we think of Muslims now. I mean, even I would say that, like, you know, what I said earlier at the start of this discussion about modernity being a flattening of reality, a destruction or an amelioration of the vertical dimension, and the pure mechanization, the horizontal perception of reality, the instrumentalization of reality, is something that Muslims, you know, paradoxically enough, have fallen prey to almost like in a Trojan horse kind of fashion, where they feel like they've resisted, you know, this impulse, but in very fact they've actually given into it more than anything else, which you can see most manifestly in what you were just discussing, right? The idea that in a certain sense people look at the prophetic message and they say it is done and dusted. No, it is not done and dusted. It is a path, one that one must engage on very actively and with a great deal of practice and struggle. As you say, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, was not just, you know, plucked out of the air by virtue of no goodwill on his own, you know, or no effort on his own. He earned union with the divine and has invited us to follow him. And that in order to do that, we must actively engage in this active interpretation. And what does it mean to engage in this active interpretation? It means to forget about the finger, to look for the moon, and that when you start looking for the moon, you realize that the finger doesn't matter that much, and that if you use a different finger, it would still be pointing at the moon. You recognize that the signs, by and large, are immaterial.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Fine. So let's maybe sort of close off in the 30-40 minutes that we have with practicalities, solutions.
Sure.
For all your philosophizing, you also have started. You've written. So you know you're on Substack, which I'll link in for people who want to have their minds frazzled. and but also really interestingly, you have you started a think tank called Pickthall House, and in the context of that, you've also appeared on, you know, GB News right, a couple of times.
Yeah, indeed.
Really interesting, and I advise people to actually, you know, check out Mustafa's performance on GB News. But very, very, very impressive, actually, how you kind of handled situations, difficult questions, difficult situations from
I appreciate
a kind of,
it's not
a semi-hostile sort of interviewers and stuff. Okay, so you've also tried to dabble in the real world, right? And which is important because obviously none of this is for the sake of intellectual, you know, self-satisfaction, but it is to hopefully afford real change and I suppose whatever the opposite of flattening is, right? A deepening of the actual reality.
I would say the way to think about it is a reenchantment of reality.
Yeah. Say more about that. Why you talked disenchantment before? What does that mean to you?
It doesn't mean the belief in magic. You know, that's the problem. Like everybody looks at this and thinks, okay, well, it means that to adopt this like reenchanted traditional worldview means to like believe in magic and miracles and the contravention of the laws of logic and to subserviate reason to your emotions and tribal impulses. And it has nothing to do with it. It has simply to do with continuing to front and center the question of why it is we do things. To front and center the act of actively interpreting life and activity. Oh, I have a good example of this actually. I just thought, which is to consider history. What is history? What is history? Right. So is history a profusion of facts? 4500 BC, Khufu gets 25,000 slaves to build a pyramid. Okay, fine. 33, 45 BC, Julius Caesar gets stabbed 23 times, in a diabolical plot. Okay, 33 AD, Jesus Christ gets crucified, or does not get crucified, depending on who you ask. And 570 AD, the Holy Prophet is born, etc. Is history simply a collection of facts, which is descriptions of events that have taken place that are strung together in a certain sense? Is that really what it is? And is that what makes history meaningful? And the answer is no. History is only meaningful. History is at its best when it's narrativized. It is at its best when the facts come together in order to tell you a story. And the story is one of what? It is a story of nobility and grace and heroism and maybe cowardice and jealousy and bitterness and love and fear and courage and death and birth. And it is through this something that it genuinely captures when history is at its best, when it genuinely captures something that is true in a deep sense about the human condition. And this also, by the way, speaks to the sort of quote unquote the truth in a lot of great historical fiction. Right? I mean, there's a certain kind of, parochiality that goes in saying that there is no deep truth in fiction of any kind. Whereas I think more and more as I've gotten older, funnily enough, I've come to recognize that actually history, like fiction, is only interesting to the extent that it is mythic. It is only meaningful to the extent that it is mythic.
And mythic here meaning?
Mythic in the sense of exemplifying or portraying some aspect, some principle of the human condition or of its relation to reality. Capital R reality, namely God. And so, when you read the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and you read about, creation and heroic myths, but not just heroic myths, even fables, like Aesop's fables, or the story of the 1001 Arabian Nights. You realize that in a certain sense the tropes, the themes, the commonalities are not, again, these are simply images, metaphors, symbols, something that they're pointing at, something archetypal that is in a deeper sense more true than any of those specific instantiations.
Of course, yeah.
And to the extent that our study of history, our study is mythic in the sense that it is able to point at this thing, this principle, is the extent to which it is meaningful, to which it is valuable.
Yeah, but frankly, then you can just say that about basically all inputs.
Correct. That's exactly that's my point. Yeah, exactly. And so to the end. So when we engage in life, right, there needs to be this constant sense of what is the story? Almost asking the question, what is the myth? What is the thing that is being? What does this mean?
Yeah, exactly. Fine. Okay, so that's how we reenchant the world.
That's what I meant. Yeah. That's what I mean.
That's what you mean by reenchanting the world. Sorry. Yeah. How do we get there?
Yeah, it's hard. It's
all right. Let's go. All right.
Okay.
Thanks for the podcast. Yeah.
No, I think it's kind of. I think it's hard. I think it firstly requires the right kind of person, I would say. I think in a, well, I don't know. I was going to say you actually, but to a certain extent, I think that because of how hollow and how dead the tradition is, I want to say capital T tradition. So this includes, obviously, Islam, but it also includes religious tradition in general, and I would say a great deal of political tradition. I would say because it is so ossified, so hollow, and so dead, I think that it requires really quite an anomalous view of the world in order to get to a point where you even recognize that something is wrong.
But don't you think that recognition is? I think that recognition is rapidly increasing.
I agree, but people are seeing it at the level of its fruits, right? So people are seeing, the loneliness that comes about in modern life. They're seeing, marriages break up. They're seeing, populations die out.
No, but I think but I think it goes beyond. Yeah, I think the average person is seeing, maybe having the awareness at the point, in relation to all the various difficulties that you've seen, the symptoms that are there. But I'm saying, I see that the fundamental questions around and the things that we have been discussing from so many different quarters are being asked and being developed actually in significant ways. I do think that what I don't see much of anywhere, again, and this is not just a comment on, it's across the board, which is that really connecting to going from the sort of the theorizing around what the issues are
to a practice.
Exactly, which is obviously important. Why I want to have this discussion now as well, right? Okay, so look, I mean, but put some stuff, just what are your hypotheses in terms of practical things that now need to be done?
Sure. I think that, largely speaking, I think you need a couple of things to take place. You need you
need people to get it first.
Well, yeah, so you need a kind of myth-making, right? You need a kind of, storytelling or a kind of clarification of what it is that has been lost,
Yeah.
and what it is that is there to gain, namely the divine itself, right? And to a great extent, this is what you are doing right here, and what we're attempting to do right now.
Is it the Meccan period, essentially?
Exactly, right? This is the Meccan period. That is the Meccan period. And there's another project that I'm sort of involved in called Kasurian, which is meant to be a sort of Muslim high culture magazine, and it is not simply which you guys are also very welcome to find on Substack. I think it's a wonderful production. I think the guys there have done a great job, but I think the sort of purpose of it is to exemplify a way of living, a kind of high culture that I think Muslims have fundamentally lost, to show them that it is in fact possible to be Muslim and to act, to believe, to behave, to think in a totally distinct way, comparably to how, often changing your point of view gives you a deeper appreciation for your original point of view. And so, sorry, what was I saying? Oh yeah, you need this kind of myth making. And that's what this kind of engages in, the formation of a nascent and new culture. And this needs to take the form of, it will inevitably take the form of writing, of philosophy, of conversations, of salons, of relationships, of media and its production, of films, of fiction, of histories that are written, stories about the future, fables, and ultimately ideas that are conceived of at a fairly nebulous, soft level of society. And so that brings me to the next part, which is the quote unquote harder level of society. And I don't mean hard in the sense of difficult. I mean hard in the sense of concrete. And that is, if the former, namely the creation of myths and norms and fuzzy values, must take place via conversation, dialogue, and media and discourse, then the second has to take place in the form of institutions, right? And so you therefore need a new theory of what institutions could look like that remain fundamentally virtuous. And it's kind of funny to say this because, I'm saying this, and everybody wants to say this in the Islamic context as if it was something like brand new that has never been done or tried before. And I would say that no, it has been done literally every single time anybody has done anything interesting or good or valuable or important. And again, I'll point to an example that is particularly in today's time, fairly anomalous to discuss, which is the American project. If you consider the founding fathers of the U.S., who are these elites who existed in the northeast of what is now the continental U.S. and were breaking away from the English Empire and establishing a new state and determining how it was to be run, then they stepped back, thought a great deal about their philosophical project, their ultimate principles, and then handcrafted a bunch of institutions to best exemplify those principles. Obviously, the one that is most touted and lauded in the American context is the notion of liberty, and how everything, from the separation of powers to the checks and balances system to the constitutional amendments, have to do with the defense of the liberty of its people from the tyranny of the state. But what's interesting about this is that you recognize that even in that process, you see that they have deeply considered a certain set of principles and then gone about trying to design a system commensurate with those principles. You see this even in the case of Napoleon, who brought to order a France that was gripped, in his Napoleonic system, in his fomentation of a new bureaucracy, of a France that was gripped by the hysteria and fervor of being immediately post-revolution, of immediately decapitating itself and looking for somewhere to go. Napoleon channeled that fervor and ended up bringing, first order and then subsequently a lot of war to much of Europe. But the same process. But this was not all entirely destructive, by the way. It's not like this is not meant to be an apology for Napoleon. But much of the Napoleonic system currently exists in France today and is in fact incredibly successful. Right? This was part of his legacy. It was a legacy that was in fact incredibly successful. There's a reason we remember him as such. And this occurs even when considering, vastly different contexts like the civil rights movement or even the formation of the state of Pakistan. You have a set of people who have a set of values and principles in mind, and by focusing on those values and principles, they have to first create a set of myths, a story about what something means. In the case of America, it was, manifest destiny in the land of the free and the home of the brave, or in the case of Pakistan, it was this Muslim homeland. It's like Muslim Zion, this one place that was a fundamentally Islamic modern state. Like every other state, you go to Saudi Arabia, it is filled with, Bedouin tribes of a certain flavor. You go to Bahrain, it's Bedouin tribes of a different flavor. You go to Palestine, it's Levantines of, it's Semites of a third flavor, and if you go to Indonesia, then it's, and so on, right? Whereas Pakistan had a story that had to be told initially. So you first need to tell that story, the story that this is what the project is. This is what we are trying to do. And then secondly, you need to start coming up with institutions that are required in order to enforce or enact or organize or exemplify the virtues that you are fundamentally concerned with.
Do we have any such institutions in Britain today?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's hard. I think a lot of the institutions were originally designed for that purpose, right? This is why, for example, Parliament. I mean, even the extremal case of Parliament is a good example where it was meant to be a place where it would feel truly representative of people and their concerns and their needs, and the extent to which it is now functioning or capable of doing that, at least given the current political crisis in the country, I don't think is very.
When I asked the question, I actually intended at the
Muslim institutions,
at the faith community level.
No, yeah. I know, but I do mean it more broadly as well, right?
Sure,
so
sure.
or you can consider the University of Cambridge or Oxford, which historically were seen to be beacons of free speech and free enterprise and free discourse, which are now under fire for clamping down on those very same things in order to push some kind of political agenda that's undermining it at its very heart. In the case of the Muslim community, I mean, the reason I pointed at other institutions is to highlight that it is not simply a Muslim problem. Muslims particularly also have this problem, but it is not just a Muslim problem. It's a problem endemic to life at this time in history. But in the context of the Muslim community, I think it's very, very, very hard. I think that the factionalism, sectarianism. Do you mean specifically in the UK, by the way, or in the Muslim world?
Yeah. I mean, mainly UK, US, like these.
Okay, fine. So considering the UK or the US, I would say the US is a slightly different kettle of fish. But in the UK, I think that in a certain sense, the ulama class, the elites, have fundamentally failed. I think that they.
So you mean the religious elite?
Yes, I do mean the religious elite. I also think this is true of like the non-religious elite, the sort of administrative and political elite, who further sought to. So I think the religious elite have failed because they've lost sight of the truth. They've confused the wood for the trees. They've started doubling down on their ethnic creedal, literalistic and petty distinctions, and they've, in a certain sense, instrumentalized those distinctions in order to cement their places in society. And this has done nothing to quote unquote further the cause of God. It has done nothing to bring mankind closer to the divine, to a harmonious, just, kind, and loving way of life. I think it has fundamentally put the cart before the horse, right? It has subserviated the truth to its expression, to the creed, or even worse, to their own status in society. And then you have the sort of like political elite, who I would say are culpable immediately after the religious elite, the administrative elite. Who I would say, and this includes everybody from Muslim MPs to mosque administrators, right? Who are not the religious elite. The religious elite I would consider to be like scholars, who I would hold to be most guilty and most culpable for the sorry state of affairs that we currently find ourselves in. And then, in the case of the political elite, I would say that again, it is further. The issue is twofold. It is not recognizing the extent to which the religious scholarship has drifted and strayed from a principled commitment to the divine, to the truth, and secondly, to use this as an excuse to again, further absolutize symbols, to consider the fixity of sectarian lines, between Sunnis and Shias and Barelvis and Deobandis, and between Malikis and Hanafis, and so on and so on, and to further recognize that, and to further consider these to be tribal or identitarian emblems, much in the way that you were discussing, in order to help make it easier for them to either cement their own place or for them to do what they think is their job, which is to caretake a community. But it is not their job. They're ultimately speaking, everybody's job, in the deep ultimate sense, is to point at and to drift towards the divine. And everything must be geared towards that and evaluated from that point of view. And if something does not bring you closer to the divine, it must be torn down.
But in a lot of these cases, it might be felt by the people who are in these positions, as well as the followership, that there is a sense in which it feels as though it's moving toward, that they're moving towards the divine, or there's some sort of greater knowledge or recognition, even though you or I might think, well, in this particular case, that's misplaced. But sometimes the difficulty is that there can be sort of, wrong and strong can come together.
I agree. So I think, sort of like as it says in the Gospel of Matthew, right? I mean, like, the tree will be judged by its fruits. And you look around at the community, particularly in the UK, and you evaluate. You just ask the question, like, objectively, right? Like, has this worked? Right. The tree, we don't necessarily plant the tree for its fruits, but you will judge the tree on the basis of its fruits, And so I'll get to what I mean by that in a minute. But in the context of the UK, you just look at the state of the community and you realize that this is a disaster. You realize that this cannot possibly have been what the Prophet, peace be upon him, intended. You look around at the backwardness and the degradation. You look around at the clannishness and the tribalism. You look around at the petty, at the sort of ossification and sectarianism, the clannish ties, the infighting, the fact that we underperform the native population or even other minority groups on basically every metric. Cannot possibly. This has nothing to do with the fact that we were poor. It has nothing to do with the fact that we were targeted. Other groups have come in, were also poor. Other groups were also targeted. If you were a non-Muslim and evaluating the Muslim community from the outside, what conclusion would you come to looking at the underperformance of Muslims relative to Indians and the Chinese and Buddhists?
Listen, you can be Indian and Muslim, yeah.
No, sorry. I am also Indian Muslim.
Oh, there you go.
But no. Relative to other groups, what other conclusion would you possibly come to other than that it must be Islam that is causing them to fail, and then Muslims ultimately mess up because they hear that, they firstly imbibe it, they can see that must be why they're failing, and then they cope with it, saying that, oh, this must be a good thing. It must be a good thing that we are failing in the world right now, because the world that exists here is not for us. It is the akhirah that is for us. It is the afterlife that is for us. This world is simply but a veil and a dream, and eventually we will pierce through and we will abide by, God's beautiful bounty in the afterlife. And, there will be some sort of like petty contest to this, which is like, oh, no, but Islam is not like Christianity. Islam is still a practical religion. We are still meant to do things in the real world. And in a certain sense, it's not just that. It's not just that that's true. It's which is obviously true, by the way, that Islam is a practical religion, but the objection is even deeper than that. It's more principled than that, right? It's the idea that essentially, if you were to stop and consider what a divine existence would look like, and you look around and see the state that we're currently in, and you ask yourself the question, is this the kind of existence that most deeply honors that which we hold dear? And if you see that that's not true, you recognize that you can't possibly give up on this life. You can't possibly give up on this life. You must exemplify virtue. You must look for divine beauty. You must manifest principle everywhere, all at once, all the time. And that is, in a certain sense, the only way. That this is precisely what it means to love the divine. This is precisely what it means to love God. It is to want to see him, to want to manifest him, to want to exemplify virtue in every place, in every scale, all the time. And so that doesn't just mean gardens and rivers after we die. It means gardens and rivers here as well.
Okay, so let me bring the practical question to you, and
Wait, does that make sense?
yeah, of course, of course. Yeah, if I unless I ask for clarification,
No. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
it makes sense. But let me hold your feet to the fire a little bit and ask and bring the practical question to you. Then, like I said, you started some of these projects. They feel as though they've been some early momentum to a certain degree somewhat interrupted. It feels to me as though you have incredible vision, perspective, and potential. What's holding you back from really, like, I don't know, taking all your sort of agenda forward, and frankly, to just lead on what you have said needs to be done?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I think that in a certain sense, okay, to further contextualize, I guess, this conversation, right? To give you an example of what some of these projects are, there's the magazine that I discussed earlier, which is in a certain sense a high culture magazine concerned with a new way, a reconsideration of Muslim political life, of Muslim of Muslim history, of economics, of culture. Alongside it, there's another project that, and I will clarify a little bit as I go along. There's another project based in Oxford called the Oxford Islam and Justice Program, which has to do with a deeper evaluation, a reevaluation of what it means to have a modern political theory that you could get to from within the Islamic tradition that makes sense now, particularly in the Anglo context.
And what form does this program take?
So the program itself, the program is
it a program as in something that people can participate in, or just like a think tank type?
No, it's a series of seminars. So it's
Right.
a series of seminars and lectures that we hold at Oxford, and consequently there will be essays that are published mostly by the speakers. We've had a bunch of speakers, from Muhammad Fadl to Ramon Harvey to a bunch of other people, come in and discuss essentially Islam and liberalism. And this is what I mean by modern political theory in an Anglo context is the sort of like is liberalism, and I don't mean liberal in the sort of like trans modern progressive sense.
Like classical sense. Yeah.
I mean it in the classical sense, which has to do with the defense of freedom, small states, individual liberties. The sort of American project, right? And the question is, to what extent can we recover much of those ideas that will allow us to exist and organize ourselves and harmonize our communities in a broader, multicultural, multi-ethnic society. The extent to which this is even possible, and not just possible from a pragmatic point of view, namely, we have these Hindus and Jews as neighbors, and so we got to live with them. We have to find some compromise, but actually a principled basis. To what extent is it Islamically desirable to find a mode of existence, not necessarily to seek out a multi-ethnic community, but how desirable is it to find a mode of existence that makes sense within a multi-ethnic, multicultural, liberal world.
Okay.
And the extent to which we are to tolerate distinctions within our own communities and also distinctions across communities. And so this basically forms a sort of like the intellectual heart, right, of another project, which is the think tank that I just mentioned, that you mentioned. And so the think tank Pickthall House is fundamentally concerned ultimately with the extent to which it is possible to exemplify that idea, the idea that it is in fact possible to be Muslim and to maintain a principled commitment to liberalism in an Anglo context in a way that I think most frankly Anglos don't believe we're capable of.
So is it policy making, policy engagement?
So that has to do so if the Oxford Islam and Justice Program has to do with like abstract political philosophy and has to do with like discussing, I don't know, McIntyre and Maturidi. The think tank has to do with policy engagement and current affairs. So it has to do with like figuring out issues that are plaguing the Muslim community by and large right now, and to take a sort of like principled liberal stance that is informed not despite the fact that we're Muslim, but because we're Muslim in the modern world. And so an example of this that will help make this a bit clearer is the sort of like largely staunch opposition of the think tank to the discourse around Islamophobia. Because again, there's multiple arguments here, right? Like one is like just purely from the POV of results, has this set of arguments like materially resulted in the betterment of our perception in the broader world? And the answer is no. Like talking about Islamophobia again and again and again and again and again has resulted in nothing other than the broader sense that we cannot take responsibility for our problems, that every time we are critiqued, we are too thin-skinned, and that ultimately speaking, we will never change, that we are fundamentally incapable of self-reflection, right? And if you were not Muslim and you were looking at the Muslim community, go nuts every time somebody says something critical of Islam, you'd say, yeah, well, this is exactly what you would believe. That's exactly what you would believe, that, okay, these people are fundamentally thin-skinned, insecure, and cannot take responsibility for themselves. They are not capable of civilized life, which is why, this sounds very harsh, but this is what the discourse looks like right now, right? This is why. This is why the political landscape feels the way it does. And so I'm not saying that that's true, by the way. I'm just saying that that's,
But it gives the impression. It gives that ammunition.
It does give that sense. And so then, so that's one argument, which is that it has simply not worked. And the second argument is that it's not adequately principled either, because it is by the same freedoms, it is by the same freedoms that Muslims are permitted to freely practice their faith, to wear the hijab, to dress how they like, to say what they like, that other people invoke when they critique or criticize Islam. Now, obviously, there's a distinction between a critique of, or even a drawing of the Prophet, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and somebody coming up to a Muslim and saying, "I'm going to shoot you next Wednesday." Like if somebody says the latter, that is a formal crime. That is a crime, right? But the former is in a certain sense an expression of precisely the same freedoms that we invoke when we engage in Muslim religious life in the West, and that if we are engaging in religious life in the West, we must protect those freedoms unilaterally in a principled way. If we don't, then we will continue to be seen as a sort of fifth column entity. So that's like a second thing that Prithal House is deeply concerned with. And then a third thing, which again is an expression of the deeper sense that, Islamic political life can take distinct forms in the West, is the idea that ultimately speaking, and I don't just mean this in a jingoistic sense, in the sort of like fake sense that, like a lot of like, ethnic minority MPs love to trumpet, yeah, okay. I won't give name. I won't say names. But like a lot of ethnic minorities like to trumpet is to fundamentally be concerned with the benefits of the community in which they currently live and are embedded in, to genuinely want what is better for Britain, for not just British Muslims but Britain as a whole. It must be the case. The way the standards that Muslims ought to hold themselves to ought to be such that they genuinely believe that by virtue of there being Muslims in this country, the society as a whole feels better off. Whereas even now, when you hear the way Muslims talk about immigration to Britons, to I want to say native Brits, you can tell that even they know that it's a punishment. It's like, oh, this is revenge for empire. This is revenge. This is as if we are we are the curse. We are God's curse that has been inflicted upon you as a result of you invading our lands and stealing our spice. It's like just the kind of mentality that betrays, the idea that fundamentally, I don't know, it's and so in a certain sense, the tertiary goal of Pickthall House is to exemplify deeply the idea that, if religious communities, if faith communities are to exist here, then they must exist to the betterment and elevation of their communities, of their host societies. And the principle, obviously, that this expresses, right, is the idea that it is once again possible for faith, for a commitment to the divine, to find a shape to exist even in an Anglo-liberal context in a way that it hasn't meaningfully for the better part of the last 250 years, I want to say. Even the Church of England has largely felt anemic. But only now, as you've been saying, people have clocked that something is wrong, that things have gone far enough, reality is flat enough, their lives have insufficient meaning, they need to wake up and find a way to live. And it is important that they find a form of political and social life in the modern context that remains authentic to in the American context, the liberal tradition here, rather than fundamentally opposes that context, because as a result of their awakening, because everything is so meaningless, they then double down on the, do I want to say the word backwards? Yeah, okay. Backwards, sort of like often sectarian, often rote, often traditionalistic
ways. Fine. Okay. So,
what does that make sense?
You're currently obviously still working in sort of finance alongside like these sort of other interests.
Yeah.
Is that the balance that you want to maintain for the foreseeable future, or in an ideal world, would you be dedicating yourself more fully to actually taking these projects forward?
I think it's a good question. I think for the moment, I think a large part of what I'm concerned with is ensuring that, again, I don't miss the wood for the trees, and so that I don't confuse the projects for what their goals are, because the goals are what's important, right? The principles are important, not the ostensible.
But it doesn't feel they're all great projects and really important ones. It doesn't feel to me, as a sort of outside observer, that they're necessarily being done justice in terms of like the I suppose the
commitment that's needed,
the enabling resources, human and financial.
I think I agree. I think to a certain extent I agree.
And so to that extent, people are going to need to jump.
Okay, I see. I feel the pressure.
Side hustles must become main hustles.
Okay, I think inshallah, I mean, God willing, I think this is like, ultimately speaking, it's like I said earlier, right? Like, I think this is the thing that is most meaningful and most important.
I'm telling you to go for the moon as well.
I know. I can tell. I feel it. I do. I understand it. I do understand it. I think, and it's not just these projects, right? Like, ultimately speaking, it's the mission is the reenchantment of reality. It is the reinculcation, the thickening, the three-dimensionalizing of reality, the discovery of the moon once again. Rather than having stared at signs of the moon constantly for the better part of the last few hundred years, I want to say.
Great. All right, look, our time is up. Any final thought, reflection, quote?
No,
anything you want to bring us home with?
I think the process by which this takes place is necessarily going to be quite painful and not trivial, which reminds me of an old tradition attributable to Imam Ali, which goes something like, it is only when a man dies that he awakens. And this does not just mean the death and to awake to the afterlife, but also the idea that in order to truly awake to the divine, one must shed everything that one is. That this is the nature of fana, and that when you think about it, it can't possibly be a pleasant process.
That's what I should have quoted when I was trying to get you to leave your job.
Yeah, I know.
Shed it, bro. That's it. You've sermonized against yourself.
Yeah, I know. Every time somebody gives advice, I've been told, every time somebody gives advice, they're really giving it to themselves.
Yeah. No, absolutely. No, I know the feeling. Well, look, this has been really, really just awesome. Thank you so much. I do have a final thing.
Go for it. I do have a final thing. The final thing I would like to say, and I think this is like principally and fundamentally important, is that a large part of the theory of change, of my theory of change, and this connects to the idea of myth making and institution building is the third thing I really wanted to mention, is that it really doesn't take a lot of people. Is that it really, really doesn't take a lot of people. It takes really, you'd be surprised at how malleable the world can often be and often is. If you look around, you'll find, Steve Jobs said this very famously, right? That like everything that you see, from traffic lights to buildings, roadblocks, and, satellites and the internet and, universities and, political theory, all of that was eventually made by, was ultimately made by somebody. Like somebody did that. Somebody made a choice and did that. And almost everybody else decides to follow the lines that somebody else has done. Necessarily, in order for any kind of large-scale project to take place, you need a vanguard class. You need a set of people, normally a very small set of people, who eventually foment and inside whom the seeds of a new way of life are crystallized. Obviously, the archetypal example is the Holy Prophet and the Sahaba, but also this could be extended to Jesus and his disciples, Napoleon and his generals, Confucius and the literati, the Buddha and the Sangha, and everyone. And so to a certain extent, and it's not always also like one archetypal guy and everybody around him. You need a small community of people, all of whom are committed to principle, to a new way of life. And eventually what happens is, with sufficient myths and sufficiently many institutions, you hit some kind of tipping point, and then society changes. You have something like the French Revolution, or then the Declaration of Independence in America, or like the partition event in Pakistan, or something huge can happen as a result of the activity of really quite a few people. And so the thing I'd like to mention, like I guess the parting thing is this: that again, more generally, you'd be surprised at how few people it takes. I think, it took 50 Bolsheviks to kickstart the October 17th revolution, 1917 revolution in Russia, right? It took 50 Bolsheviks, and that's what you needed: 50 cadres to foment a movement that ultimately decided the fates of hundreds of millions of people for 100 years.
Yeah. No, that's I won't comment, but if you feel like you're a founding father or mother of this new movement, please get in touch via our website. Yep. All right. Perfect. Thanks, Mustafa. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. That was awesome.
And guide all your efforts. And yeah.
Amin, and yours, sir.
I hope you find what you're looking for.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
I hope so too.
Until next time.
Thank you.